Now, obviously, in America, you can raise money, build your own private school with a particular ideology, so long as it doesn't violate, so long as it doesn't violate the Civil Rights Act and various other laws. You can build a school around your religion. You can build a school around a certain kind of teaching ideology, and parents who value that can just go there. You could have a critical race theory school that's privately funded, and no one, given that it wasn't, for instance, racially segregated, you could teach Kimberly Crenshaw all day. The question is what you are and are not allowed to teach on America's dime. And I've long been a supporter of banning the teaching of, for instance, creationism in publicly funded science classes, given that it's not true and not the consensus of the science community. That's just one example. Obviously, this is another example you've used in your writings about this is, if a public school teacher starts foaming at the mouth about the Jews or Nazism, they'd be out in a second. But in a broader, more principled way, most people wouldn't object to a well-written law that says you can't teach Nazism, right? So in principle, it's, I agree with you. It's a mistake to simply frame this as a free speech issue, right? Like any law that could possibly be written banning ideas taught in public school is wrong, right? I don't think, anyone who's pro anti-creationism laws and so forth can't say that. So then the question is, what ideas do we want to ban? And so to that end, can you talk a little bit about the laws that have been passed in various states, Tennessee and Texas? These have been called anti-CRT bills, which, reading the bill seems it's an understandable label, but there's quite a lot in there that feels like it has very little to do with CRT and is just, to take one example from the Tennessee bill here. One of the first things it says is, you can't teach in a class the idea that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. Right? Like that's someone, regardless of what you think about CRT, no one sane wants teachers teaching that, right? So there's a lot of stuff in these bills. So can you talk about how these bills came about and what their aim is?
Yeah, I think what people are trying to figure out at the beginning of this year, as a lot of these courses, first in the federal government and then in schools, became known. I did a series of stories starting last December and going through the spring, where I was showing applied critical race theory in public schools, teaching a range of just like really outrageous and I think abusive practices with kids as young as pre-kindergarten. And so you have to try to figure out, well, what is your recourse in a democratic society for this? And I think that's an important context. So you have really three avenues for recourse, three avenues to kind of address this problem. You have the executive. So President Trump passed an executive order at the federal level. Governor DeSantis issuing guidance at the executive level in Florida, working with his state board of education. You have the judicial level, which we've talked about. So actually taking it to the courts. Does this violate state law? Does it violate federal law? Does it violate the Constitution? And then third, and I think most importantly, you have the state legislatures, which in every state in the country, state legislatures set the curriculum for the state kind of standards in K through 12 schools. And then they also direct significant amount of funding towards those schools. And so many state legislatures, I think we're now at 8 state legislatures, and then another one if you count 9 if you count the state boards of education, have come up with a kind of bill style or a bill, a kind of format or a template to basically say we want to prohibit these abusive practices. And the first one you mentioned, I think, is important. Is want to ban schools from promoting, advancing, or compelling students to believe that one race is inherently superior to another. And on one hand, it sounds crazy, right? It's like, well, nobody would want to be teaching that. But in fact, we have a lot of schools that are teaching that. They're not teaching it in a very simple way to say that, race X is superior to race Y, but they're certainly ascribing kind of traits to the race, they're ascribing specific traits and value judgments, negative and positive, to specific racial categories that are treated as essential in nature. So you have, for example, these kind of programs or modules or texts on whiteness that argue that this essence of whiteness that is that constitutes white people, culture, virtues, habits, laws, governing structures, etc., that is pervasive in society, is inherently racist, oppressive, evil. So you're ascribing a certain moral superiority, or in this case, moral inferiority, to a racial category. And you see a lot of that. I mean, it's sophisticated. It's not really necessarily direct, but I think that's really what gets people's kind of ears pricking up and saying, wait a minute, what are they teaching? What is this based in? What is the condition for this kind of belief? And why is it being taught in schools?
So where are kids hearing this kind of thing? Would it be at an assembly or in like a social studies or English class or something in your research?
Yeah, a lot of it is, social studies classes. I think that's probably the general ed, social studies, et cetera. And, there's a lot of specific examples, but one of the things that I think is you see over and over that's recurring is that you see intersectional hierarchy. And sometimes it's taught even at very young level, even in kind of grade school level. They're teaching Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality theory. I mean, explicitly, this is Kimberly Crenshaw. This is intersectionality theory. But then what they're doing is they're having kids, in some cases, fill out their intersectional identities. So listing out on a kind of school worksheet their race, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, household income, disability status, language, etc., and then actually ranking themselves, and then kind of by necessity comparing themselves to their classmates on a hierarchy of a hierarchy where the axis is the oppressor and the oppressed. And
so you have examples of this. How old were the kids?
In one case, they were 8 years old. So in one case in California, in the Bay Area, they were actually having 8-year-olds do this. So very young. I mean, I have a 10-year-old, and I can remember back to when he was 8. This would be kind of, I mean, seemingly very strange to even make that decision. And, so they do it with children. They also do it with teachers at teacher training programs. That's another place that you see this. And some of them are very, explicit. In every school in the Springfield, Illinois school district, they were having a training where teachers were told to measure themselves on an oppression matrix, to actually kind of break down their identity categories to figure out how they were being oppressive, whether they were suffering from covert white supremacy, and then atoning for those sins of again, identity traits that are, for the most part, fixed. You can change your religion, you can learn a new language, but the most important ones are more or less fixed.